Empaths never forgive this. Emotional intelligence lessons. Sarcastic. We live in a culture that treats empathy as a soft, endless resource. We picture high empathy people as perpetually forgiving absorbers of other people's emotional storms, always understanding, always offering a second chance, always absorbing the blow. But this is a dangerous misunderstanding of how high emotional intelligence actually works. Thoughtful. Empathy is not a lack of boundaries, it is an extraordinary level of perceptual clarity. When someone with refined emotional awareness looks at you, they don't just hear your words, they read your underlying motives, feel your emotional state, and track the subtle patterns of your behavior over time. They see when you are hurting, but they also see when you are being manipulative. Because an empath's default state is to grant grace, people often mistake their patience for weakness. They assume that because an empath forgave them yesterday, they will forgive them again tomorrow. They push the line, step over boundaries, and take advantage of that emotional open door. But there is a hidden threshold inside high empathy individuals, a precise psychological line that once crossed changes everything permanently. When you cross that line, something shifts. There is no loud screaming match. There is no theatrical drama or tearful confrontation. Instead, there is a quiet, total, and permanent emotional shutoff. The door closes, the connection dissolves, and the access you once had to their warmth is revoked forever. So what is that single line? What is the one betrayal that a deeply empathetic, emotionally intelligent person will never forgive, no matter how many times you apologize or how much time passes? Stay with me for the next few minutes, because understanding this single mechanism will transform the way you evaluate your relationships, protect your emotional energy, and navigate human connection. If you have ever felt taken for granted, or if you want to understand how high EQ individuals establish unbreakable boundaries, you cannot afford to skip a single second of what we are about to uncover. High empathy individuals possess sharp emotional awareness, cognitive and affective empathy. Their patience is a deliberate choice, not an inability to enforce boundaries. Empaths will tolerate minor flaws, but they cut ties when they detect systemic exploitation of their emotional goodwill. What empaths never forgive is not a single mistake, but the deliberate weaponization of their empathy, manipulation disguised as intimacy. When an empath reaches their threshold, they do not rage. They execute a complete, calm, and permanent emotional disengagement, the quiet door slam. Mastery over one's emotional landscape ultimately requires protecting one's cognitive bandwidth from chronic toxicity. Empathy is frequently miscategorized in modern discourse as a soft, passive, or fragile trait. We tend to conflate a person's capacity to feel deeply with a susceptibility to being easily swayed or mistreated. However, when viewed through the framework of high emotional intelligence, empathy reveals itself as a sophisticated mechanism of perceptual clarity rather than a structural weakness. True empathy consists of two core components: cognitive empathy, which is the mental ability to step into another person's mind and map their perspective, and affective empathy, which is the emotional capacity to feel what another person is experiencing in real time. When these two components are highly developed within an individual, they do not create a defenseless victim. They create a master observer of human psychology. Because high empathy individuals possess such an acute sensitivity to the emotional states and underlying motivations of others, their default response to human imperfection is often patience and grace. They recognize that human beings are flawed, that stress induces poor behavior, and that people often act out of unhealed wounds rather than outright malice. Therefore, when an empath overlooks a slight, offers a second chance, or absorbs an uncomfortable emotional outburst, they are not doing so out of an inability to defend themselves. They are making a conscious, deliberate choice grounded in self-awareness and emotional regulation. Their patience is an act of generosity, an intentional expenditure of their own emotional bandwidth to allow the other person room to grow, apologize, or self-correct. The critical error made by those with lower emotional intelligence is mistaking this intentional patience for gullibility or helplessness. When an individual assumes that an empath's quiet demeanor or willingness to forgive indicates a lack of personal boundaries, they are fundamentally misreading the dynamic. High emotional intelligence carries with it an inherent understanding of value, specifically, the value of one's own peace and psychological safety. An empath does not lack boundaries. Rather, they hold their boundaries with such internal security that they do not feel the need to weaponize them through aggressive displays, loud arguments, or constant posturing. They observe patterns silently, tracking whether the grace they extend is met with reciprocity or exploitation. When people attempt to push past an empath's boundaries, assuming that past forgiveness guarantees future compliance, they encounter a stark reality. The empath's capacity to understand why a person acts poorly does not mean they will tolerate being mistreated indefinitely. Understanding a behavior is not the same as condoning it. High EQ individuals maintain a sharp distinction between extending compassion to a struggling human being and allowing that human being to inflict chronic emotional drain on their life. Their boundaries are firm precisely because they are rooted in self-awareness. They recognize that their emotional energy is a finite resource, one that must be protected if they are to maintain their own mental equilibrium and continue offering authentic support to those who truly respect it. Ultimately, far from being a liability, refined empathy is an immense power. It allows an individual to read between the lines of human interaction, to separate honest mistakes from deliberate manipulation, and to manage their own reactions with calm precision. An empath's tolerance is not an open door, it is a managed space. Their kindness is a choice that can be revoked the moment it ceases to be respected, demonstrating that the deepest capacity for emotional connection requires an equally profound commitment to self-preservation. Every individual has a threshold of endurance, but for a person with high emotional intelligence, that threshold is defined by a very specific boundary. High empathy individuals do not operate on a short fuse. They are fundamentally equipped to handle the messiness of human relationships, recognizing that lapses in judgment, bad moods, and clumsy mistakes are natural byproducts of the human condition. When someone forgets an important date, speaks hastily under stress, or fails to communicate effectively, an empath's immediate reaction is rarely anger or immediate rejection. Instead, their high emotional bandwidth allows them to contextualize the error, looking past the immediate mistake to see the person's underlying intent, stress levels, and emotional state. They are entirely willing to absorb minor flaws and friction, understanding that no relationship can survive without a healthy reservoir of grace. However, this high tolerance for human error makes the true breaking point even more distinct and severe. An empath's breaking point is not reached through the accumulation of minor, honest mistakes, but through the clear pattern recognition of systemic exploitation. Because an emotionally intelligent person tracks behavior across time, they are able to differentiate between someone who is genuinely struggling with their own issues and someone who is consistently using emotional goodwill as a license for selfish behavior. They notice when an apology is sincere versus when it is merely a strategic phrase used to reset their patience. They observe when their empathy is being treated not as a gift of connection, but as a convenient buffer that absorbs the consequences of another person's toxic actions. The transition from patience to the breaking point occurs at the exact moment the empath realizes that their open-hearted nature is being systematically leveraged against them. This is not a matter of hurt feelings or minor disappointment. It is a profound realization that the integrity of the relationship has been compromised from the inside out. When an empath sees that their willingness to understand has been turned into a tool for manipulation, their internal calculus changes entirely. The grace they previously offered was predicated on the assumption of mutual respect and shared humanity. Once they perceive that their compassion is being harvested to enable chronic disrespect or emotional parasitic behavior, the rationale for maintaining patience completely evaporates. What makes this breaking point so decisive is that it is not arrived at impulsively or during an heated argument. It is a slow, quiet, and deeply considered psychological evaluation. An empath will often give someone numerous silent chances, opportunities for the other person to realize their impact, adjust their behavior, and restore balance to the relationship. Throughout this phase, the empath is actively evaluating whether the dynamic is capable of health or if it is inherently predatory. Once the pattern of systemic exploitation becomes undeniably clear, the decision to disengage becomes absolute. The boundary is not drawn out of spite, but out of absolute psychological necessity, as maintaining connection under such conditions requires the destruction of their own self-respect. The breaking point of an empath is a testament to the fact that emotional intelligence is as much about self-preservation as it is about connecting with others. They do not allow their empathy to become an instrument of their own destruction. While lower EQ individuals might stay trapped in cycles of chronic abuse, continually hoping that their sacrifices will eventually change the other person, a high EQ individual recognizes when a situation has passed the point of healthy redemption. They accept the reality of the dynamic without denial, recognizing that when emotional goodwill is met with systemic taking, the only rational response is to revoke the privilege of their presence entirely. To understand what an emotionally intelligent person finds genuinely unforgivable, one must look closely at the mechanics of human connection and trust. A high empathy individual does not expect perfection from those around them. They are fully aware that people are inherently flawed, prone to lapses in judgment, emotional outbursts, and moments of profound selfishness. When a friend, partner, or colleague makes a mistake out of fear, ignorance, or stress, an empath's natural instinct is to deconstruct the situation, identify the root cause, and offer a path toward reconciliation. They can forgive broken promises, harsh words, spoken in heat, and complex personal failures because these actions, while hurtful, are typically rooted in human weakness rather than malice. What an empath cannot and will not forgive, however, is a fundamental breach of emotional integrity, the deliberate, calculated weaponization of their empathy. This is not a simple mistake or a momentary loss of control. It is an intentional strategy wherein another person recognizes the empath's capacity for compassion and chooses to exploit it as a leverage point. It happens when someone uses the empath's desire for peace, understanding, and connection as a shield against accountability. When an individual learns that playing the victim, shedding insincere tears, or performing artificial remorse will automatically activate the empath's protective and forgiving nature, and then uses that tactic repeatedly to manipulate outcomes, they cross the ultimate psychological boundary. This form of betrayal strikes at the very core of what makes empathy valuable. Empathy requires a person to make themselves emotionally vulnerable, laying down their natural defenses to tune into the internal frequency of another human being. It is an act of profound trust. When that trust is met with psychological gamesmanship, when intimacy is faked, remorse is scripted, and compassion is treated as a weakness to be harvested for personal gain, the foundation of the relationship is irrevocably shattered. The empath realizes that the relationship was never a genuine exchange between two equal minds, but a one-sided transaction where their goodwill was being systematically looted. The deception involved in weaponizing empathy is what makes it far worse than an explicit, aggressive act of hostility. An overt attack or open disagreement is honest. It allows both parties to see where they stand and address the conflict directly. Manipulation disguised as intimacy, on the other hand, is inherently parasitic. It forces the empath to doubt their own perceptions, wasting their valuable cognitive and emotional bandwidth on trying to heal or help someone who is actively sabotaging them behind a mask of vulnerability. It transforms what should be a sacred space of mutual care into a battlefield of hidden agendas and covert control. Once an emotionally intelligent person identifies this pattern, the shift within them is absolute and irreversible. They do not merely feel hurt, they recognize a fundamental incompatibility in moral and emotional frameworks. The act of using someone's kindness against them demonstrates a complete absence of basic human respect, proving that the perpetrator views the empath not as a whole person, but as an utility to be managed. For a high EQ individual, this realization completely neutralizes any lingering feelings of warmth or duty, as they understand that continuing to forgive deliberate manipulation is not an act of love, but an act of self-betrayal. When a person with high emotional intelligence reaches their ultimate boundary, the resulting reaction often deeply confuses those who do not understand how emotional self-regulation functions. People frequently expect an explosive emotional climax to follow a major betrayal. They anticipate shouting, dramatic confrontations, tearful ultimatums, or elaborate displays of anger designed to make the offender feel guilty. However, high EQ individuals possess a sophisticated grasp of emotional economy. They recognize that anger, rage, and overt conflict are active forms of engagement that require immense amounts of cognitive and emotional energy. To fight with someone, to yell at them, or to demand that they change is to remain deeply invested in the relationship. It signifies that a person is still fighting for the connection, holding on to the hope that the dynamic can be salvaged through sheer force of will. An empath who has reached their threshold operates on a completely different psychological plane. When they decide that a boundary has been permanently crossed, they do not enter a state of combat. They enter a state of profound, absolute emotional disengagement. This phenomenon, often referred to in psychological terms as the quiet exit or the emotional door slam, is not executed out of spite, passive aggression, or a desire to punish the other party through silent treatment. Instead, it is a deliberate, calm, and protective shutdown of the emotional channel that previously connected them to that individual. The empath simply stops pouring their vital energy into a space where it is continually devalued or weaponized against them. This emotional disengagement manifests with a chilling, sudden clarity. The warm, attentive presence that the empath once offered vanishes overnight, replaced by a polite, distant, and unshakable neutrality. They no longer ask probing questions about your life, no longer offer unsolicited support during your hard times, and no longer engage in deep, meaningful conversations. If contact must be maintained due to work, family, or shared responsibilities, the empath interacts with the precise efficiency of a professional acquaintance. They answer questions directly, avoid unnecessary details, and completely withhold their vulnerability. There are no passive-aggressive jabs, no hidden hints of bitterness, and no attempts to seek revenge, because revenge would require them to care enough to spend their mental space on the person who wronged them. The terror of this disengagement for the recipient lies precisely in its peacefulness and permanence. When someone is accustomed to using high-conflict dynamics to manipulate or retain control, a calm, emotionless wall is impossible to break through. You cannot manipulate someone who no longer seeks your approval, and you cannot weaponize the feelings of someone who has consciously chosen to feel nothing toward you. The empath's silence is not a cry for attention or an invitation to negotiate. It is the final declaration that the trial period for the relationship has ended and the verdict has been rendered. The privilege of access to their inner world has been quietly, permanently revoked. Ultimately, this complete withdrawal of emotional investment serves as the ultimate act of psychological self-defense. High empathy individuals understand that their capacity to care deeply is their greatest asset, but if left unprotected, it can become their greatest vulnerability. By mastering the art of total emotional disengagement, they ensure that toxic individuals cannot hold them hostage in endless cycles of conflict and false reconciliation. They do not need the other person to admit their faults, offer a sincere apology, or validate their pain to move forward. They grant themselves their own closure by simply closing the door, locking it silently, and walking away into their own peace. At the foundational core of emotional intelligence sits the imperative of self-awareness, an internal compass that guides how an individual processes emotions, sets priorities, and navigates the complexities of human interaction. While self-awareness is often discussed in terms of understanding one's own triggers, passions, and personal strengths, its most critical application lies in how it dictates self-preservation. High EQ individuals possess a acute, continuous awareness of their internal bandwidth. They understand that their mental clarity, emotional equilibrium, and cognitive energy are finite resources that directly govern their quality of life, their creativity, and their ability to function effectively. Consequently, they do not view the management of their social environment as a secondary concern, but as a primary responsibility necessary for maintaining their psychological health. When self-awareness is fully integrated, an individual begins to perceive their emotional landscape through a lens of strict stewardship. They recognize that every person they let into their close circle exerts a direct influence on their neurochemistry, stress levels, and focus. Allow chronic toxicity, passive aggression, or manipulative dynamics to persist in one's immediate sphere, and the cognitive toll begins to compound. It degrades decision-making capacity, drains daily motivation, and occupies valuable mental real estate that should be dedicated to growth, meaningful work, and genuine relationships. Therefore, self-preservation is not an act of selfish isolation. It is a calculated, necessary strategy driven by the profound understanding that one cannot pour from an empty or contaminated vessel. This high level of self-awareness naturally transforms how an individual evaluates their relationships and enforces boundaries. Rather than waiting for a situation to deteriorate into open crisis, a self-aware person continuously monitors how interactions affect their internal state. When they notice that a particular relationship consistently leaves them feeling drained, second-guessing their reality, or forced into defensive hypervigilance, their self-awareness prompts an immediate reassessment. They do not ignore these subtle internal signals or rationalize away red flags out of a misplaced sense of obligation. Instead, they trust their psychological feedback loops, recognizing that chronic discomfort in a relationship is often the mind's early warning system, signaling an environment that actively threatens their emotional well-being. Ultimately, the mastery over one's emotional landscape requires the courage to make hard, uncompromising decisions regarding who is granted access to that space. A deeply self-aware individual accepts the reality that they cannot change others, nor can they control how toxic individuals choose to behave. The only variable within their direct control is the degree of access they permit. To protect their cognitive bandwidth from chronic toxicity, they establish boundaries that are non-negotiable. They understand that preserving their own peace of mind is worth the temporary awkwardness of setting a firm limit or the finality of cutting ties completely. By prioritizing self-preservation through deliberate self-awareness, high EQ individuals ensure that their emotional resources are preserved for environments and relationships that cultivate mutual respect, clarity, and genuine psychological safety.